Let's go ahead and hit record and get started. Great. Thank you, Carly and the Microsoft team for hosting us on Skype for Business. We'll be recording this, just so y'all know. We are also taking notes in the Open Referral Legal Services Working Group document. I just included the link in the chat column, and that link is also in the message that you received. So if you open up that page, that document, and scroll down to page 5, please make sure you're listed in the attendees. Add any links into the section that you want us to see as we're talking, if you have them. And you'll also see a set of open questions that we collected at the Affinity group, which was a sort of prologue to this working group. With all that said, I'm going to kick us off and review the purpose and the agenda. We're going to do very quick introductions, like really, really quick, because we do have a bunch of folks on here, which is great. And then I'm going to kick it to Tim Davies to tell us a little bit about the technical starting off point for our work. So without further ado, I'll jump in. I've met many of you, but some of you are new to this process, which is awesome. My name is Greg Bloom. I lead up the Open Referral Initiative, which works with referral providers and resource directory maintainers around the country and the world, developing open standards and interoperable technologies and open business models around the sharing of community resource directory data. We have a number of projects in the field of civil legal aid service providers, and the Legal Services Corporation's Technology Innovation Grant Program contributed additional funding through their 2017 TIG grants to facilitate a working group, that's us here, that will sort of coordinate among the different implementations of the open referral format in legal service directory information sharing systems around the country, which is awesome. So we do have, in this document, you see we have just an overview of the vision, building a future in which this information about which legal aid resources are available to people is easy to share, find, and use in various ways. Lists out our objectives, which is A, supporting the various implementations around the country of the open referral format in TIG-funded projects, and B, to share learnings and best practices from across those projects and also from across the broader Open Referral Initiative. And then C, most importantly, to potentially develop a proposal for an extension to the Open Referral format that describes information types that are specific to the field of legal services, since Open Referral is a relatively minimal specification. So we'll be conducting a series of conference calls over the next year. This is the first. We'll have another one in September. We will have an in-person gathering at the Technology Innovation Grant Summit in January, which I believe is in New Orleans, and then we'll have a final proposal session, and that will be it. This won't be a long, drawn-out process. I'm hoping we can cover a lot of ground in those 3 or 4 conversations. That said, all of this framework is open to your feedback. We can potentially offer tweaks. This is a living document. So I will pause there. Let's get a sense of who's in the room, and then we'll kick it to Tim to hear a little bit about the Human Services Data Specification. And then once we've heard about the Open Referral format, I'll create some space for questions about the process as well as the format itself. Okay, so let's just go, I don't know if the order that I see is the same as everyone else, but let me go through and call folks out and have you introduce yourself very briefly, who you're with, and what's your context for joining this conversation on a Friday afternoon. Carly, since you've hosted us, go ahead and introduce ourselves.
Sure. I'm Carly Ichiki. I'm with Microsoft, and I am working on the statewide legal access portal project with LSC and Pro Bono.
Awesome. Jim Harris. I know Jim is calling in, so
sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, Greg.
That's all right.
I got it. Yes, Jim Harris with the National Center for State Courts, also a member of OASIS, the International Standards Organization, and working on a couple of technical committees there, including one on litigant portals, which is where our interest in open referral comes into play.
Cool. Jennifer Singleton?
Yeah, Jenny Singleton from Minnesota Legal Services State Support Office. And we are submitting a TIG application, and a part of that is implementing the open referral system.
Great. Xander?
I'm Xander Karsten. I'm with Legal Server. I'm a project manager. I'm working with Florida in the implementation there. Also, with a couple of other groups, and have been talking to Greg about this for 4 years plus, maybe at this point.
Yep. Been a minute. Tim, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tim Davies from Open Data Services Co-op in the UK, here as technical generalists who try and support the use of standards that link up policy and technology in open data sharing. So I'll be involved as, I think, tech partner on the project.
Great. And Tim is, to clarify, the sort of deputized steward of the open referral format elsewhere in the initiative. Let's see. We have some folks on the phone. I don't see names. Go ahead.
Hello.
Who's that?
Oh, this is Abhijit Chavan from Urban Insight Open Advocate. And I'm working with Idaho Legal Aid Services on a grant to implement open referral on the Open Advocate platform for Idaho and several other programs, LSC programs.
Great. Who wants to go next? Someone join us.
I can go next. This is Manav. You'll see my name as Manavendra Roy. I'm with Microsoft, and I work with Carly on Legal Access Justice Portal with LSC and Pro Bono. My role in that project is more of like an architect and stitching technical things together. That's what I do.
Great. Thank you.
Greg, else? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hi, this is John Greiner with Just Tech. We work in the legal aid community on all kinds of technology projects and services, but worked in legal aid directly for about 20 years in technology and in information referral, and served on actually still serving on the New York State Alliance of Information Referral Services, as well as the board of 211 New York, and have been working with New York City in implementing 311 initially, and working with Law Help for really about over a decade, and frankly have been a frustrated member of the community in terms of working in a more efficient way to get people to where they need to go and to be much more customer friendly than we've been.
All right, let's see. I see.
This is John Higgins.
Hi, John.
This is John Higgins from Tech. We're a nonprofit technology in Palo Alto. We've been working with Greg in Open Referral for over a year in some form. We're implementing Open Referral on a tech platform for legal services in Florida, working with Legal Server and Xander, and we're working on some more preliminary analysis work in the Bay Area in San Francisco.
Great. Jane, I see Jane. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Hello.
Sure. Jane Ribidenera. I'm with the Legal Services Corporation and part of the TIG team, the Technology Initiative Grant Program. So we have funded this project, and as well as a number of other projects to implement the open referral in different platforms.
Welcome and thank you. And I see Sam Halpert. All right. While we wait for Sam, who looks like he's on mute. Oh, is that him?
How do I?
I cannot. I see you chatting, and I hear back.
It says I'm muted. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now? I'm talking.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. It's a little bit noisy. Great. It's a little noisy where I am, so I'll stay muted when I'm not speaking. I'm Sam Halpert. I am the Law Help Program Coordinator at Pro Bono Net. Law Help is a custom content management system designed to send up legal information websites of the type that the LSP provides for in its grants insurances. I'm very excited about the potential of this project, and I'm hopeful that Law Help will be able to participate in the near term with building out support for open referral through our API, and I'm also excited about this conversation, looking toward future development for.
All right.
So,
Sam, you started to break up there a little bit. Okay, Sam, you started to break up there a little bit, so I'm going to put you on mute. And did we miss anyone? Has anyone not introduced themselves yet? I think we might have gotten everybody here. Cool. Great. So once again, we have the framework for this group and the meeting notes and the agenda in the document that's linked in the chat column. Please feel free to add comments or in that chat column or in the document. And I'll just very briefly review the rest of the agenda. We will hear from Tim Davies about the open referral format, a little bit about the human services data specification, what's in it, and how we're developing it. We'll take a couple of quick questions, although really I'm hoping to identify questions that we could answer afterwards so that we can keep moving along. And we'll also hear a little bit from a couple of other from the people who are actually implementing the standard on funded projects. We'll hear brief descriptions, hopefully from John at Benetech and from Xander, and as well as from Abhijit and potentially from Sam. We'll hear very brief descriptions of their implementations and their projects. And we will also try to create some time for a couple of updates from related data standards initiatives in the space, specifically from OASIS, which I believe Jim Harris is on the phone and can speak to. And if Margaret Hagan hasn't joined us, I'll talk a little bit about her work on schema.org. And we'll create some time for questions and suggestions. We'll be reviewing the process over the course of the next 3 or 4 phone calls. And if we have some time at the end, I want us to look ahead to January at TIG and think about what we might want to accomplish when most of us are actually all going to be in the same space together, and how we might want to prepare for that. Any questions, any suggestions before I kick this to Tim Davies to learn about the open referral format? Tim is sharing slides in the document, so if you're not seeing this video, but you are following along in the document, you can take a look at the slides that he's about to talk about. All right.
So hopefully I should now be sharing my screen, and I can get the slides up as well. Can you see that?
It's loading for me. Yep, there you go.
Okay, great. So I know some of you are already very familiar with the human service data specification, and others of you may not be so much. So I'm going to try and do a very quick overview. But if there's any questions, we can pick those up. So what is HSDS? Well, if you go to the website for it, you'll see this description: an exchange format for publishing machine-readable data about health, human and social services, their locations and the organizations that provide them. And that's got a number of parts to it. One, it being an exchange format means that it describes how to exchange information from machine to machine. And it suggests or hints at the kinds of information that are useful to collect and exchange. But what it does not do is set out very, very explicit and kind of strict requirements for what must be shared, or describe domain-specific categories to use when structuring that information. So think of it like a form that gives you the fields to fill in, the boxes to fill in when sharing information about services and organizations. but with very few of those fields where the computer says no, and it's going to say that's not valid. So it's the exchange format, but the default HSDS is very light on the amount of validation it does, or kind of strict requirements it places on disclosure. And that's an important distinction, because I think when many people hear standard or specification, they might think of something that says exactly what you've got to provide. Here we're talking about that exchange format specification, onto which you can then layer requirements for what must be shared in a particular domain like legal services. But by out of the box, HSDS doesn't have that there. But it means instead of data from one system being entirely incompatible with data from another system, we align how we're exchanging that information and streamline that process. And the other part of that definition was that it's there as a publishing format. It can be used for private exchange of information, but the focus and what it's designed around is the open sharing of referral information. The idea that instead of managing this information in silos, we want to be able to openly share information on services, organizations, locations, and for the information shared by one organization to be easy to combine with, map to, work with information shared by another. So the structure of HSDS is based around these three core elements and the kind of link between them. The idea that there are organizations who provide services, there are services, there are locations where they're provided, which can be physical locations or can be virtual locations. And then lots of the time, those services are linked to a particular location, and the particular location will have different phone numbers, schedules, contact numbers than the service in general. So on the left here, you've got all those core elements: organization, services, locations. On the right of the shared screen, you can see all the different things HSDS specifies that can be expressed about those services or locations, from schedules, contact details, programs they're organized in, address details, importantly things like eligibility and classification of those. And as I said earlier, it doesn't set out the classifications to use, but it sets out here's how you express and communicate a classification when you've got one. So that idea that it's taxonomy agnostic by default, but obviously in particular domains like legal services, we may care about using some common taxonomy. So that's something I think this working group may find it's engaging with. The specification itself at a technical level is defined using the Open Knowledge Foundation's frictionless data package and the table schema specification. And so HSDS version 1.1, which is what you'll find on the Open Referral websites, specifies how to use flat files for the import and export of bulk data. So you take data from your internal database, decompose it into a table of organizations, a table of services, a table of locations, put in the foreign keys or keys that can connect those together, and provide that as a package of data that can be read in by other systems that understand the HSDS. However, there's also work ongoing right now to develop an API based on the same data model, but for more dynamic access to data, so being able to read it in a single organization or service record and synchronizing up between systems. So that's what we've got at the kind of technical level. And the last thing I think we wanted to address just in this overview is the process of developing HSDS. So it's great that on this call we've got people involved in very formal technical standards bodies like OASIS. We're on a journey towards more structured governance from something that was developed as a rapid prototype, and then we've been moving it towards more stable governance. So right now we're using semantic versioning to say this is version 1.1 of HSDS. Any changes in the 1.0 series or 1.x series will be backwards compatible. We try and make it as stable as we can. There's an open governance process taking place via an issue tracker, and at the moment we're working with a process as close to community consensus as we can get on any proposed changes. So that's kind of how we're governing and updating. So again, from this project, I'm anticipating we'll have lots of issues coming up that need to go in there, and we need to find solutions that either extend HSDS for legal services, or that say, here's some changes that have come up that are really important for everyone, from our learning in legal service applications that we put into the next version of the core standard itself. So yeah, that's a kind of rapid overview. Greg, does that give you the key things you were wanting there? And I'm happy to pick up any questions.
That's great, Tim. Thank you very much. Yeah, let's get a range of questions from folks. I'm going to try to let me actually get like everyone's questions, and I'll take notes, and some of them I'm actually going to answer afterwards, and some we'll just answer on the spot. So go ahead, and I'll just take notes on your questions as you go around, and we'll see what the span is. And you can either chat them in the chat box, that might be the easiest way to do it, or if you have something, just come out and say it. We might not have any questions at this time. Awesome. Cool. Well, if we don't have any questions about the... Oh, go ahead. Hello?
Sorry.
Oh, okay. So this won't be the last time to ask questions about this, but it sounds like, we do have... This is all pretty documented, the process and the specification. I'm happy to take your questions about the process, and I can direct your questions about the specification to Tim. And I'm happy to move ahead and actually start hearing from the folks who will be. Actually, let me let the folks from the OASIS call speak briefly about their work on standards before we start talking about the various implementations that are happening in this group. Because I think some of the folks in the OASIS process might be joining us right now, but might be about to leave. So let's get a brief description of what's happening over at OASIS, and I don't think Margaret Hagan is on the call. So after that, I'll give a brief description of what's happening at the Stanford Legal Design Lab. Jim?
Yes, and I don't know, John Greason, who co-chairs the technical committee I mentioned earlier, is going to try to join us. I don't know if he was able to yet or not. I'm assuming he'll chime in if he does. But anyway, the technical committee I mentioned is a part of what's called the Legal XML member section of OASIS. And there's a number of different technical committees developing standards relating to many different aspects of legal systems, including electronic court filing and things like that. But there's a relatively new technical committee called the Litigant Portal Technical Committee that was formed just in the past few months. And in fact, we've had, I think, 2 conference calls kind of getting things kicked off. But the idea behind the committee was to develop standards around some litigant portal modules that were defined in a paper that was done in 2015. It was published by the National Center for State Courts. I can provide that link. But the work was done by a number of practitioners who were brought together to develop both business and technical requirements for what they imagined that would be litigant portals that could be stood up by state, although it's certainly not constrained to that. But so within a given state, they would put up this portal, and there would be these defined modules identified in this paper, each providing specific capabilities that would support the portal that users or litigants or potential litigants could come to try to figure out what kind of resources are available, what the things that they need to consider for the type of matter that they describe in lay terms, communications, interactions with those different resources. So these modules consist of things like a registration module, a navigation module, what we were calling a problem identification module, which is some logic to kind of gather that description of their matter in lay terms and try to make some sense out of it and parlay it to where it really fits from a legal perspective, and hence help us figure out what kind of resources might be appropriate to provide them some assistance. Then was imagined a solutions module, which would kind of take that input and come up with all the various approaches, the different paths that they could go down. And the one that is most relevant to this discussion is what we're calling the assistance module. And in that would be a module that would interact with different resources, third-party service providers, and other forms of assistance that or other organizations that could provide assistance to potential litigants. And it's that particular module where we could see leveraging the open referral standards, because we would be defining interfaces with that module and those interactions with other organizations. And it's not just simply points of contact and things like that, but interactions to kind of help the flow of things from a user perspective. It would be somewhat, or could be somewhat, transparent, but at the same time incorporating and accommodating the various policies and ways of doing business with these different organizations that provide that assistance. So as you might imagine, that can go in a lot of different directions, but we're hoping the open referral standards can help us get a lot further down the road than we might otherwise be able to without it. The initial focus of the Litigant Portal Technical Committee will be on identifying those messages that would be needed and the information or information models appropriate to those messages. We do see down the road maybe a little focus on the actual transport mechanisms, but that's not really the focus of the committee right now. The key is the messages and what data is needed.
Okay.
So
and can you tell us
nutshell?
Can you tell us a little bit about the process? Like, how often are you all meeting? What kind of who are you trying to have involved, and what's involved in being a part of the OASIS process?
Yeah. So it's an OASIS technical committee. OASIS has very strict guidelines in how committees operate. You do have to be a member of OASIS to participate. There's different levels of membership. We've gotten a number of organizations involved in this particular technical committee, including Microsoft, a couple of providers of case management systems and e-filing systems, a number of practitioners, folks who are actually implementing, for example, those involved in implementing the portal mentioned earlier in Florida are involved. So we've got a lot of different folks involved in the process. We do a monthly conference call. We're planning a face-to-face meeting, which will probably be held in August. A lot of it's kind of up to these committees how often they meet, but this will be at least monthly by phone, and then a periodic face-to-face meeting, maybe every 6 months.
Great.
Go ahead. Question there?
No, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Greg, this is John.
Hi, John.
I got on and I figured out how to unmute me. The importance of the OASIS membership has to do with ensuring that the standard that is produced is completely in the public domain. And the strict membership requirements have to do with waivers of IP rights of those people participating in the standards preparation, the standards creation. And that's so the reason it's done in this tightly organized way is to guarantee that the final product is completely open to the public.
Sure.
In every form. All standards are extendable, so people can take them and use them and adapt them to their needs. I wanted to mention one other aspect of the ideal portal that we envision beyond connecting to a service provider's online intake process and having a really hot referral. We want to make sure that we have the best possible information from the providers about the availability of resources before we even make a referral. And so what we envision is an application that sits on the provider's computer that records detailed information about the types of cases that they want, the criteria that they use in choosing those cases, and the number of cases that they can take. Right. So that and then they would just keep that updated on their computer, and some sort of a bot would go around and collect and update that data. So what we really are needing is a lot of expertise and participation from service providers so that they can fully inform us of the kinds of criteria that we would need to be able to include in this standard in order to accomplish this two-way communication from the portal to the providers and from the providers to the portal in terms of the real-time availability of resources.
So that's very helpful. I'm going to make a little bit of a process point and then a content point. First, it's great that there are processes like this happening out in the field. And it seems like to the extent that we're doing work that you all are hoping to learn from, we definitely want to have open lines of communication. John and Jim actually asked me to serve on the technical committee, and there may even be funding to actually pay for a membership on the technical committee. While I'm open to that, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to actually serve in that capacity. I would love to see someone from this working group assume that leadership, and so we're not going to probably figure it out on the call, but if anyone here might be interested in representing the work that we're doing to the OASIS technical committee that's developing this, standards for litigant portals, I would love to nominate you and lobby to make sure that the cost of membership is paid for, and I would support you in playing that role. If there's nobody else that steps up and they still really want someone from the open referral process on there, I can look into doing it myself, but I'm hoping to promote leadership from our network on this, since you all are actually the subject matter experts for this particular field. So having said that, putting that, I will be following up with this group to see if anybody wants to step up and take on that role. Meanwhile, my feedback to John and Jim, which I've shared before with them and I've shared with the folks in this group, we are trying to standardize things that exist in various capacities and data types that are, to be blunt about it, boring, right? And that's because it's you have a bunch of different systems. They're all more or less describing the same things. We're trying to just develop a predictable agreement among those systems. What John's talking there at the end in terms of identifying the capacity of every individual service provider to provide services to new clients, from what we're seeing in the field, that by and large is information that doesn't exist in many cases in a datized form. And so it's not really, I don't know that it's a data standards problem. And we've been really careful for this round of the open referral format development to define a very specific scope around information about the organizations, the services that they provide, the location, the information people need to know to access those services. But we recognize that there are some areas of that domain especially around eligibility requirements and especially around capacity issues that are potentially extremely complex and may even involve institutional challenges and not just issues of like vocabulary and syntax. And so we are not committing in this round, at least, to specifying those things at great detail. I think ideally we would learn about what it would take to specify those things in a standardized way through this cycle and make proposals for future cycles to go that far. But we're being very careful to recognize that some of, if we were going to try to deliver all the information that everybody wanted to have in an ideal world, we would probably be putting ourselves into a world of hurt and asking more of the service providers that are in our implementations than maybe we're prepared to ask and maybe they're prepared to give. So that's something that we hope to learn about. This is my message both to everybody here and on the Oasis call. We want to learn as much as possible, even though it's not actually a strict part of our deliverables to turn in standards for issues of capacity and even at a very complex level issues of eligibility criteria. So I just said a lot. Any questions for me or the Oasis folks about that process point as well as just the Oasis process in general? If there are questions, you can chat them in the column or just call it out. Cool. So I will follow up with a request to see if anyone is interested in serving as the sort of open referral delegate to the Oasis process.
I just had a question on what you just
Is that Carly?
said. So, yeah, sorry, this is Carly.
Go ahead.
So just to clarify then, that whole, identifying the capacity of the resource provider and standardizing that model, that's currently out of scope for this round?
For this cycle, we are hoping to learn about it, and by the end, we can very well put together proposals, at the end. If we get there, that's awesome. If we find out, like, oh, people are doing this, and here's how we should structure it in a standardized way, that's great. But we saw pretty early on that that eligibility and the capacity issues, there's so many variables and so many unknowns and so many institutional implications for those things that we're just hoping to learn through this process and not actually promising to define those things. That doesn't prevent anybody who's in this network from actually going ahead and specifying things in their implementation. Yeah. In fact, we encourage that because we can learn, right? If you try to do it, you collect data about whether it works. That'll make it that much easier for in the next iteration of this whole process for us to go that far. But we're taking it incrementally and starting at a common baseline around things that are easy to define because they're already in use.
Got it. Thanks.
And I guess maybe just to put that, I've dropped a diagram into the document that I find really useful when we're thinking about the standardization process and getting the right balance between standards and flexibility. Big standards are all about the incentives of people to align what they're doing and share things in common ways. And we're really distributing effort between whether the people producing data have to name everything exactly the same and use the same terminology, whether intermediaries take 3 different ways people are talking about the same concept and render it the same, or whether the user at the end has to work out with 5 different kind of ways people are talking about things, what this is, am I eligible or not eligible. And I guess that the philosophy would be, at the very least, we don't want users, we don't want people wanting to deal with human services or legal services who have the least expertise and the most need to have to do all that sense making. So we want this to happen at least at the intermediary or the publisher level. But we can't necessarily kind of say to people right now, converge on the same language when underlying those different ways of talking about eligibility or capacity are, as Greg says, all sorts of organizational issues. So I would hope we at least get to the stage of saying we're describing our capacity in the same column or in the same box, but we might still be using different terms or different codification schemes to describe it. But hopefully communities of, sub-communities within the overall referral community will converge on some common language, or often will already have converged because they're part of different institutional structures. So I think that may have overcomplicated what Greg said, or hopefully added some context to it.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Tim. And again, I would love to be surprised in this process. But so if folks already have a vision for how these things should work, and you're able to share it, and it aligns with the vision and the practice from other implementers in the field, we very well may overperform beyond our expectations in terms of how far we can get agreement. That said, we're anticipating that the scope that we've laid out very carefully is highly achievable, and I suspect that these things are actually going to be pretty complex. So hopefully we just learn enough to make the next round of this process to make those things highly achievable. All right. Any other questions? I can talk a little bit about the Stanford Legal Design Lab, led by Margaret Hagan, who's written a lot about informatics for legal services on the web. They are also leading a articulation process, a specification process for describing information about legal services, specifically in schema.org's micro formats for the web. So they're operating on yet another sort of layer. We're developing an exchange format, an API specification. They're describing they're essentially articulating tags for publishing data on web pages to be indexed by Google and Yahoo. Again, their scope, like the OASIS conversation, I think is broader than just ours. We're just focusing on the directory, but it's certainly relevant to them. And again, there's hope that the work we do to articulate these information elements can simply be modeled in schema.org. They are going to be having an in-person gathering in Stanford in July. If you are interested in participating in that process, especially in representing the learnings that we've had through the open referral process in that conversation, please let me know, and I can connect you with Margaret and see if we might be able to include you as a participant. Cool.
Greg,
so,
to the extent that it's useful, I'll be participating in that as well. This is Jim.
Awesome, great, cool. Okay, so I wanna hear a little bit from the folks on the call who are implementing open referral this year in various legal service projects, and we're also looking ahead. What I'd like you all to do is start setting our agenda in terms of issues that you found that you think we need to be focusing on over the next year. These are information elements that are at play in your implementations that you're already seeing are above and beyond what's in the open referral specification. Any questions that have come up through your implementations that you're already ready to address, and ways that this process can be helpful to you, what you're hoping to get out of it. So right now, I'm happy to hear from anyone on the call, although primarily the working group, the formal working group, consists of the TIG-funded projects, and that is Florida's open referral pilot, which involves Legal Server and Benetech, and the Northwest Justice Project's TIG project, which involves just Legal Server, and also the Idaho Legal Services Project with DLaw, which rolls out into other states, but Idaho, I believe, is the primary TIG-funded one. And I think there's a Pro Bono Net project in Oklahoma. So let's hear from, I'm just going to go ahead and pick, let's hear from Xander first. If you can tell us just briefly about your implementations and what questions are already popping up. I think in particular Tim expressed interest in hearing user stories, and we do have a set of user stories that are emerging from the Open Referral Initiative. We've started to adapt them for this particular context, and if you want to start giving us a sense of what is it that the folks in your implementation want to accomplish, what actions do they want to enable, and let's see if there's any new things that are going to help us extend the specification for legal services specifically. So Xander, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. That's a kind of tall order, and I'm not sure I'll be able to hit all of those. I think, generally what we're seeing, most sort of have the most kind of pressing need is the very basic kind of, the up-to-date information, the up-to-date programs that have various needs around both referring and accepting cases that meet whatever criteria are set forth, and having those open lines of communication that are up to date and that are clearly defined. So I think that sort of very generally, that remains kind of the most relevant user story for kind of across all of these various pieces. For our implementations, we really are looking at interagency. So not necessarily from the public into an agency, but referrals between agencies and between legal service providers within the state. And I think that definitely impacts and informs the kind of information that needs to be collected, and that just needs to be kept up to date. Obviously, I think if it was a more public-facing project, those needs would be very different. So I think that's sort of, initially that is the kind of very broad baseline. And I think, honestly, that the level of sort of current information remains kind of the driving factor behind the implementations, just having that current information that's up to date, that's, verified, that we have, and that's pushed out and consistent, I think is sort of, again, that kind of just driving factor behind what a lot of the needs really are. And also the, ensuring that it's sort of a low barrier to entry, that it doesn't take a lot to keep that information up to date, because it's not going to be kept up to date. If it's, I think that kind of what we've heard over and over again is, if it's not part of a tool that people are already using now, they're not necessarily, it's going to be harder for them to integrate kind of new steps into whatever that process is.
That's great. Xander, can you give us a couple of examples? Like your Legal Server is working with the Northwest Justice Project in Washington and the Florida Bar Foundation and the associated legal service providers in Florida. Give us a sense of the differences between those two projects and what you take from that.
Sure. I mean, both of these projects are pretty new, and are still fairly early on in the process, especially the one with the Northwest Justice Project. So, those needs are really developing and are really kind of still emerging. So I think that that's something just to, as we talk, those are going to change. What I say today is going to be different than, what we talk about in January, because they're just, that 6-month period is super informative. I think, generally, while the types of information appears to kind of remain the same, right now the needs actually don't seem super divergent. I think, that the ones that we kind of have laid out and that underpin the project generally are fairly consistent. I think that there's a couple of differences just in the technical implementation, but outside of that, they seem fairly consistent. Okay.
I'll go ahead and describe the Florida Legal Services pilot, and I'll let Xander or John Higgins from Benetech fill in any gaps that I missed that you think are relevant to this conversation. So in Florida, we have a network of about 30 some odd legal service providers that are funded by LSC and or TIG. Funded by LSC and or the Florida Bar Foundation, all of whom use Legal Server, and with an anchor in Community Legal Services of Mid-Florida, who is the lead anchor on this project. We're assembling a group of early adopting lead stakeholders. This is about 5 organizations from that whole network of 30 plus organizations, and Legal Server is developing a form within Legal Server for each of those organizations to designate a person that will go in and update information about their services, the locations the services are provided, etc. That form will publish this information to a machine-readable file that will live at a URL on the organization's website, or a URI, maybe. And Benetech is then building a verification tool that will aggregate all of those self-published records, display them to a designated vettor, who will then go through and check, does this information look like it's, is the information there? Does it look like it's complete? Is it coherent? And will be testing different kinds of feedback loops in terms of, if there seems to be a problem with what's been entered, how will the vettor actually let the organization know that there's a problem? How would that be resolved? Once the information has been aggregated and verified, it will be republished by this tool. And Legal Server will then be developing the means to query that information within Legal Server through their already existing organizations module. And that's a module that currently organizations use to keep track of the other organizations that they might refer people to. And everybody needs that feature, but it's rarely used because currently everybody would have to maintain that information themselves. And so the delta that we're aiming for is for each organization to update their own information within Legal Server, and to be able to reliably query information from every other organization within Legal Server. And as a happy, positive externality of this project, we will yield open resource data on all legal service providers in Florida for other third-party systems to query, including the other legal service triage and intake projects in the state, potentially Law Help Florida, as well as 211s and other referral providers down the road. So that last bit, all of that is outside the scope for our pilot. We're just closing a loop between Legal Server instances in the state. That said, we're hoping that it sets us up to have other kinds of integrations down the road. John, Xander, do you want to add anything to that description of the Florida Legal Aid pilot?
This is John. I think that was a good overview, certainly. And, Florida is our kind of very first foray into legal services provision and all related entities there within. And so I think I'm coming at it from a bit of a idealism or ignorant idealism spectrum. So I think I can talk a little bit around some of the user stories or more user-centric things that I'm seeing. Particularly around the data elements. And so in talking to the users that are involved in this pilot, there is a lot of heat around eligibility and capacity. And so, as Greg alluded to earlier, obviously there's so much nuance in there that it is hard to get your arms around it. But I think an interesting thing that kind of parlayed out of that was the emphasis on grants, I guess. So when I look at the current standard versus kind of the actual real-world application of how people are searching and utilizing the standard, it's not that the elements aren't all contained somewhere. It's just there's some cognitive dissonance between kind of the mental map. And so what I'm finding is that a lot of times when you're going to make a referral, the user will actually have a pretty good idea going in where they're going to refer the person without actually interacting with the database or searching in any way. They have some mental map of, who is in their area. A lot of times when they're dealing with a particular case type or a particular taxonomy, there really is only one person who does that. And so a lot of times they're going in with the understanding of who they're going to pick. But one of the biggest things that certainly in conversations with Xander I've heard come up, and then certainly with the users has come up, is this idea of kind of the ebbing and flowing of grants that imply particular eligibility requirements or particular servicing of taxonomies that will change over time with some frequency, more so than things like address and phone number and stuff like that. And I think one of the strongest things that I heard come out of our current sessions that we're running with users is that that's something that is totally outside of their purview now, and it's very hard and very delayed to get that information. So in the sense, there's some organization that's nearby that you've historically referred clients to for service A, but now they just got a grant that allows them to do service B for the first time, or it opens up service B to a different population than they historically have been able to handle. And so, you may go weeks or months just with your own mental map that they don't do that service, not explicitly using a database or searching it out, before you by, probably word of mouth hear that now they offer that service. And so I think part of the interesting thing that we've been, talking through and dealing with is that the current standard is very much service focused, but the grant stuff is kind of embedded deeper than the mental model of the user. And so, practically speaking, there are grants that have, very strict start and end dates, very strict eligibility requirements. They have money that needs to be spent by a certain time or will expire after some time. And so it kind of embeds a lot of things like hours and are they accepting new clients and what the priority is for that organization. But it's all embedded in this kind of grant idea that has a clear start and a clear end. And so that's something where, like I said, the users are expecting a certain workflow. They'd be excited about hearing when grants begin or end at a different organization, when they expand their scope or reduce their scope for populations. And right now, in order to represent that in the standard, it's kind of a translation that needs to occur. So you need to do it in a different way because the hierarchy isn't set up as such. And so as I said, I'm kind of a ignorant idealism coming into this, but that's just some examples of what I've been seeing so far.
So a couple of thoughts. I've spoken with Abhijit at least once about the grants issue, and we're going to hear from Abhijit, maybe next in terms of his implementation. I also want to make sure that Tim has a chance to ask questions about that, and that other folks are able to compare their experience on this issue, which seems like it's directly relevant. If I'm understanding, this is pretty relevant to the question of eligibility and even capacity.
Yeah, I think that's really, really useful to hear, and particularly in terms of thinking dynamically about the information, because the other thing I take from what you've just said, John, is the important thing to people often is what's changed recently, not necessarily starting from a blank slate of what the services are. It's knowing, have they changed their eligibility or availability, and if so, why? What's the linked funding or the linked program? So I think that's really useful thinking there about how the information might be presented by applications, and also therefore what we need to make sure is being captured in the standard and the workflow, and I think thinking about how that fits into the components Benetech are building, and the interfaces people engage with data through, as well as what there needs to be the standard, will be important. I'm also happy to take away and do some thinking. We support and maintain another data standard called 360 Giving that's all about grant funding, and it would be interesting to see if there's ways we can reuse pieces of that standard and schema to capture some of the grants related information that's here.
And Tim, you also lead up the data standard sponsored by the World Bank, the open contracting data standard, and I even wonder whether there are elements there, because I think these grants are they might function essentially as contracts, more so than like philanthropic giving. I'm interested.
Yeah, so I think we could definitely look at that, and I think I need to do a bit more digesting, but I think the other thing I'm hearing is it's the temporal nature of provision that really matters. So at the moment, the standard is not temporal. The standard is here's what things look like now. Okay. Whereas what I guess we've just heard is that people often know here's our service until this date. And so they know at the point that they publish that we now are accepting referrals for this group, that we will stop accepting referrals for that group either when our capacity runs out or when we hit this date when our funding is known to run out. And we're not capturing that kind of information right now. So I think that's very useful.
And obviously to speak at a level that, I don't think should bubble up to a standard, but give you more kind of on-the-ground user stuff. A lot of times it's like we have a single lawyer who does this particular service, and they're going on maternity leave. And so, yes, there's a grant, but we have to disable it for 3 months because we can't serve that thing. Or, everything needs to be pushed out after this date. And so there's so much stuff going on around just when things are on and when things are off, and there's a ton of things that can drive that, a lot of which is grant related, but some of which are just kind of day-to-day operational related. And like I said, I don't think that necessarily that needs to bubble up to the standard, because I don't know that I don't know how well it extends to other, geographies and certainly other types of services, but it's just another interesting tidbit there. And then one other thing around eligibility, it's interesting in the sense that there's, from my limited experience, there's often it's actually more binary than I thought it would be, in the sense that I imagine there would be 10 fields, right? So like income of client, veteran status, all these different fields that would all need to be checked and balanced and make sure that they qualify, and every grant is going to have every one of those things listed, and you have to do all this measuring to make sure you're between X and Y. So I thought it was going to be fairly complicated, but at least in Florida, there's kind of a standard almost around eligibility. So you're LSC eligible or you're not. And so there's a couple of tiny nuances there around how income is calculated. But when you talk about mental models, the users are just, oh no, there's two buckets. It's you're LSC eligible, then therefore you can get the service for, pro bono, or you're not. And then obviously you could collect all of those sub-elements and do the calculation to translate that into that binary yes or no. But for ease of use and updating and stuff, we could also think about, collating all of that stuff into a centralized idea if there are enough of these kind of bucketed eligibility standards across the nation, I guess.
Okay. I want to hear from Abhijit and potentially Sam as well about their implementations. If folks have more questions for the Florida implementers, please leave them in the chat column or in the document. Abhijit, Sam, y'all want to talk to us about what's going on your ends?
Yeah, this is Abhijit. I can talk. Right. Hi, I'm Abhijit Chavan. I am the CTO of Urban Insight, and I run Open Advocate. We have built a Drupal-based platform for running legal services websites, thanks to TIG grants from the Legal Services Corporation. It's called DLaw, Drupal for Legal Aid website. It's an open source distribution of Drupal specifically for running public information websites. It's used through Open Advocate is our hosted version of that, where we provide a hosted version of DLaw, and it's being used. Open Advocate is being used by 12 states in the country. For this particular TIG grant, we are working with Idaho Legal Aid Services, who's the primary on the grant, and also for other states to implement the new version of DLaw 6, which has the open referral component to it. In DLaw, we have a feature for publishing a directory of service providers. And that's where we envision open referral fitting into. A DLaw website can have a repository of service providers they can build that. Not all programs using DLaw are using that feature, but some are, and some have. Some use it for just like 10 or 20 providers, and others have a couple hundred. So that directory is available online, and you can browse through and see the address information and the types of services provided. So I'm hoping that with Open Referral, we can do two things. We can perhaps add more fields to that, attributes to that record in the of a particular service provider in that directory, and also to provide a machine-readable way for that to be extracted and used in other places. That's sort of overall objective for this particular implementation for us. I was glad to see that it does not require specific taxonomies or specific fields of information. That would be useful in practice here, because not all the states using this particular feature in DLaw are using it in the same way. Each one has slightly different taxonomy of services that they've created themselves based on what seems to work for them, and so we just so that's good. We need to work out the details of how this would be implemented. So that's in short, that's where our project fits in to Open Referral. Right?
Cool. Any questions that have come up through your implementation or listening to this conversation so far? Anything that you want to put out there to shape our agenda, or maybe follow up with any of these folks offline?
Two questions. One is the idea of eligibility information. The programs using the DLaw feature are not using that. Have not asked for that specifically. But I think there's a possibility that would be useful to them. So I would love to see some more into how the eligibility information would be part of this. I think that might be beneficial if it's possible. The second question actually I had was for other TIG-funded programs working on this project is how are you planning to report the progress on this, like the metrics on the implementation of Open Referral? One way is, of course, a successful implementation that can be machine readable by some other entity. That would be one. But if you have any other metrics or milestones that record the achievement for the project or success, I would be happy to know of that, so we could do something similar in our project.
Great. We do, so at least in Florida, this is something we've started to hash out. We actually have like a whole success spectrum, and we've identified, but we haven't finalized like what our baseline criteria are and what we're going to be measuring for. The big one is, if I'm remembering correctly, fewer false. The big ones are fewer false positives in terms of like incorrect referrals being made, and more correct referrals being received among the network of legal service providers. But there's other sort of procedural things in terms of the amount of time it takes them to fill out a form, the amount of time it takes them to, we're also going to be measuring like how long it takes to verify this information along the way. So I can share the document. We actually have a public folder, and this document is available in that folder where we're starting to define this, and your feedback would be welcome on it in terms of, you all might have a metric that you've thought through that we haven't even anticipated.
That would be great. Thank you.
Cool. So we've got only 15 minutes left. Sam, do you want to share anything from the Oklahoma project or elsewhere in the pro bono net world that's relevant to this?
I'll do my best to share what I can. The Oklahoma project is still in its planning stages, and it's not clear precisely what information the Oklahoma Project is planning to draw out of the Law Help platform, or what method is going to make the most sense. I am looking very hard to, at ways in which to drive that project forward while beginning to develop open referral friendly API methods for our work. It's something that I looked at, the last time I looked at the standards closely was last summer, so I know that a lot of work has happened since then. My attention has been elsewhere this spring, but after our next code push, I'm going to be able to take a close look at all of the really exciting work that you and Tim seem to have been up to since then, and see what makes the most sense. Additionally, I'm hoping in the second half of this year to begin putting some microdata into the Law Help template along the lines of the conversation that Margaret Hagan has been fostering with schema.org. Whether that work occurs will depend to an extent on what priorities the Law Help network, the community of partners that use the site, want to set as far as what we do with the second half of our year when we have a little bit of free time. When I go into that meeting with the partners, I am going to advocate for an emphasis on microdata and using the schema.org to explore some of these issues and explain why that's an important thing. These are things that I'm hoping to do in the near term. In the long term, as we start to think about the next generation of the Law Help platform, I would love to have our entire approach to organization be directly informed by the kinds of insights into how to structure the information and how to conceive of it that are coming out of the Open Referral initiative. At this point, I'm speaking for myself when I say that that's my vision for what's happening. And we go through successive rounds of filtering based on other criteria and considerations before we get anywhere. But that's in the future. That's not in the next 6 months, which is where most of my comments will focus. That's a little bit vague, I understand, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful to you guys.
All right. If you have any, Sam, it's kind of hard to hear, but if you have any questions for us, any issues that you think should be on our agenda for future calls, please just surface it in the chat column or in the document. Do folks who've been listening in I do want to create a little bit of space for questions, although we are coming up against time. So if you have questions, go ahead and share it, and let's see if we can answer anything on the spot or push anything to offline. Anyone want to chime in? Questions, observations, suggestions? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about what happens from here. We're going to have another one of these calls on, I've proposed that the next one, since I wanted to simplify the scheduling, be the same day of the month in September, same day and time. So that would be, I believe, Friday, September 15th, and at noon Eastern. I am expecting that by that time we are going to have much more specific data from some of our implementations, potentially even proposals for how to structure some of these things. If folks are really feeling eligibility and want to actually put forth a first draft of a potential proposal, even though again it's outside of our scope, that will be the time when we can start fielding some of those suggestions. And Tim right now is just listening in, but when we start getting specific proposals for issues that we want to troubleshoot, and proposals could be that something you found in the open referral spec might need to change, which is a hard thing, or it could be that groups in this network reach agreement on extensions for legal services specific, which would be much easier for us to do. Tim's here to help us through that process. He'll be fielding the feedback that we hear from implementations, and based on what comes out, he'll be going away and coming up with proposals for us to review. So best case scenario, we have one session where we actually discuss what we're specifically learning in these implementations in the next 3 months in September. And then at TIG, we'll hopefully take some time, and this could be anywhere from an affinity group meeting to actually, like, potentially we need to carve out like a half day for us to get together and work through some of these things. And Tim and or someone from his team will be able to join us remotely to offer some data standardization guidance through that process. So I'm open to suggestions for how we should take advantage of the TIG conference when we're all going to be together. We're definitely going to be proposing an open referral session of some sort with folks from our implementations. We'll definitely have an affinity group meeting, but there may be other things that we can do while we're all face to face during that time, and then we'll have after that one final conference call during this cycle in which we'll come back together and review proposals. Hopefully that review will be happening before the conference call, and we'll get together to finalize our set of recommendations, both for LSC TIG and the associated community, and for the Open Referral Initiative at large. So
you're muted, Greg.
Was I muted that whole time?
No, just after the siren.
Any questions from the crowd?
I don't have a question, Greg, but I've got a kind of encouragement or request to everyone participating, which is what often happens with projects like this and working groups like this, is we get great input on the calls, but not between. You'll have all got the invite to this, I guess, from the mailing list. I would encourage people, the moment you are working on anything to do with the data on referrals and legal services in the next 3 months, and a question occurs to you of it would be nice if, or an aha moment or light bulb moment occurs where you realize something, please just drop it in a rough and ready email to that list, because it will really help us surface those things, process those things between times, and in my experience others will get on board and share thoughts as well. So do not be shy to message that list, so that we can make sure it's not just Greg emailing us about meetings, but it's also people sharing half-baked thoughts, reflections, ideas that we can then use to work up, because that's often where the best solutions come from.
Awesome. Any final thoughts, suggestions for us as how we can make this process more productive, more useful for you all? Please let me know. Happy to field those offline or right here. We have a few more minutes left. But if we're not hearing any other issues, I'm happy to let us go a few minutes early and go get lunch or dinner or what have you, or breakfast even on the West Coast. All right. Well, this has gone very well. Thank you all for being such a cooperative and agreeable group.
Thank you.
Greg. Thank you, Greg.
Okay. Take care. I'll let y'all go.
Bye.
Bye all.